what Moses and I are going to talk about today is how UX or product design works alongside an engineering team or a tech team or a developer team. It's called different things in different places. I wanted to talk about this particularly because I was trying to think back to when I finished GA and think of what I've learned since, and maybe what have I learned since that I have not learned in GA. And one big thing, because when you try to pack so much into 10 weeks at General Assembly, this kind of gets missed out because obviously there's no engineers in your class. So yeah, I learned a lot about these bits and bobs since, so I wanted to kind of share that, and hopefully it's useful for you all. Hold on for a sec. I can't change the slide for some reason. 1 second. I'm just going to share my whole screen. It might work better. Okay, can you see that? Yeah, so I'm Martin Murphy. I did the same course as you all back in 2018, 2019. And I got a job at Guru Systems about a few weeks after, or about a month after maybe, I finished the course alongside another person from my class actually called Ross. And there was another senior UX at the company at the time as well, who was also a former GA grad. So it was quite a nice little team for us. I've been here since then, so like 2 and a bit years, and I career changed, like I'm sure many people do who do the course, from operations management, kind of client management, that kind of thing, which I did for like 5 or 6 years. Yeah, and yeah, still loving UX 2.5 years down the line. What about you, Moses?
Yeah, so my name is Moses. I studied software engineering in university and have been working in the industry for about 10 years now. Been in Guru for 2.5 years or so, working as a software engineer and now as one of their technical leads. Yeah, and we'll get into more of what I do as we go on through the talk.
Nice. We'll talk a little bit about what Guru Systems does. Some of it's a bit like we could end up taking a whole presentation to explain about what we do, because it's a little bit complex, but we'll give it a go and hopefully only take a couple of minutes. So we're going to share some of the products that we use, not all of them. This one is called Pay. So our clients are generally housing associations, property developers, local authorities like Camden Council or whatever, and metering and billing companies. So the thing on the left is a hub. We call it a hub. It's like a little display that's embedded into the wall in the house or the dwelling, apartment, whatever. And it's a way for the residents inside to pay for their energy bills. And they can see their consumption and all that kind of thing on here. And they can also receive messages on here from their housing association or property manager or whatever. And on the right is the web version. It's on the browser, and that's used by the metering and billing companies or the housing associations, whoever, to check how the energy consumption is inside the dwelling. But also, if you had a vulnerable resident who maybe wasn't able to afford their heating and they had no credit, they would be able to top it up for them from here to help them out and that kind of thing. So our software and our hardware is used predominantly on what's called a heat network. A heat network, I'll quickly explain. So most of you probably live in a home where you've got a boiler to heat your home, and that boiler is like an energy source that provides heat throughout that one home. A heat network is a very similar kind of idea, except the energy source on a heat network is called an energy center, and that one energy source could heat thousands of homes, hundreds of homes, or 10 homes or whatever, and the pipework feeds from there all the way through, like a big apartment block, for example. So instead of having 1,000 boilers for 1,000 apartments, you have one energy center for 1,000 apartments, and it feeds all the way through. And the whole point of it is it's a more environmentally friendly, much lower carbon emissions as a result, and that's kind of what our business is all about. It's about lowering carbon emissions in the heat industry, and because actually the heat industry in the UK is the number one source of, or the biggest contributor to carbon, even higher than transport, surprisingly. Yeah, so that's a heat network, and that's where most of our tech is.
Yeah, then on this page, you can see on the very left, there's what's called a heating interface unit. So as Martin was explaining, there's the heat network. And instead of the boiler, what happens is as the heat is being supplied, it comes into this heat interface unit, which allows the heat in the network to be distributed inside the apartment. So what we have now, previously we had the device that was shown in the previous screen with the display, but we wanted to get into a different segment of the market where users don't need a display. They just want an easy way to monitor consumption. So we have what is called our Hub 3 core, which is the gray thing on the left as well. So that's attached to our heating interface unit, and we can and a meter, and we can track how much consumption, how much heat is being consumed in that home, and as well get some metrics in terms of how well the heat network is performing. And using the metrics that we're collecting, we go to the product on the right, which is called Pinpoint, and that's used for being able to tell within the heat network which areas are not working as efficiently as they should be. So these are areas where there's either loss of heat or insufficient supply of heat as should be. So this product essentially helps the heat suppliers to figure out where the inefficiencies are, and at least rather than just oversupplying the network with lots of heat to make sure everyone gets the heating that they need, the heat network can just run at an optimum level as opposed to oversupplied. Yeah.
So we kind of touched on our two kind of offerings there. We've got the pay side of things, like paying for the energy, and then the performance side of things. Pinpoint is all about the performance, as is this product, Verify. Moses and I worked on this together. It was our first project together, and worked on it again then more recently, up until about February maybe. And this is all about performance too. This is used, it's quite niche, this one. It's used by engineers on those developments to go around and make sure that the dwelling has been set up properly and that there's no like heat losses and so on. So you use it to check that this thing, the HIU on the left, and you also use it to check anything that emits heat. So your radiators, your kitchen tap, your shower, or if you have underfloor heating, and you just use it to make sure that the system is performing as it was intended to. And then if there's any problems, they're highlighted as fails, and then you can use the web app, or the developers can use the web app, the property developers, to find what failed and then go fix it. So that's all about performance as well. We have other products too, but we just said we'd give you a rundown of those ones because it might help understand how we work on our projects, which is what the purpose of this talk is for. So people often think that when you think about UX and product design, that we do our thing, like our double diamond approach, and we package it all up nice and neat, and we hand it over to a team of developers to work on it. And it's not really like that in the real world. That was kind of my assumption when I was at GA, because that is what we did really when we did our client projects, because you're not with the developers, and in most cases there actually aren't any developers yet. It's just a client who has an idea. But in the real world, sorry, I skipped this bit. Yeah, so you'd hand it over to the engineering team, but in the real world, you actually work side by side a lot more closely. Obviously, you're going to have times where UX and product are doing their own thing and where engineering are doing their own thing, but you keep each other in the loop, and you do a lot of work together, like these things that are listed, your feasibility reviews and so on. We'll go into each of those in more detail as the slides progress, but yeah, it's much more of a team effort than I thought anyway when I was at GA. Our typical project team, so we have multiple products, so therefore we might have more than one product being worked on at a given time, but a typical project team consists of the product side of it, which is 2 UX designers, one of whom will be a lead on the project. They're only lead really for the purposes of other people knowing who they can speak to if they have any questions UX related. Otherwise, it's a pretty shared load about what we work on. Then a project manager who's responsible for the delivery of the project and making sure it's delivered on time. If we needed like an extension because we realize the date that we gave 2 months ago, which is coming up soon, it's not achievable anymore. We might need an extension of 2 weeks or whatever. They'd manage that. The product owner is the person who's kind of involved the whole way through the life cycle of the product. They're responsible for the everything, not just they're the voice of the kind of the client, the customer, and the user, but they're also responsible for all the things outside the delivery, like marketing and launching and so on. Yeah.
And from the technical side, we generally have these 4 roles. So a technical lead, basically responsible for ensuring that what has been requested for by the product team is delivered. So making sure it's feasible and works within the overall architecture of the technical stack that we have as a company. And working alongside the technical lead, so is a software engineer. So the software engineer is mostly looking at what we call the backend code. So this is the code that's running on our servers. And the front-end engineer looking at the basically what's running on the browser. So based on the user interface designs. So there's the UX designers will also come up with user interfaces, and these are implemented on the front end. So that's the work of the front-end engineer to implement that. And then there's the mobile app engineer. This is specifically for projects where we have a mobile app. So they don't take part in all the projects, but where that's needed, they'll also be involved in the tech team, in the technical team.
And then sitting outside of the project team, but still involved, we've got senior management and external stakeholders. Senior management is, it depends on the business really, but for us, senior management is the C-level people. So you've got CEO, CPO, which is Chief of Products, CTO, Chief Technical Officer, Chief of Ops, Financial Director, and so on. But and then external stakeholders varies. So that might be, well, first I'll show you who speaks to these people. It's those. The stakeholders, it varies. Sometimes it's, like in the case of the UX designer, it's user testing, so it's whoever that is. But also we get a lot of grants because we're involved in energy and decarbonizing heat and so on. We get a lot of grants from places like Innovate UK and BES, which is like a government department. It's the Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy Unit or whatever. And they give out grants to people, to businesses or people actually, to help with things with social impact and so on. So we get a lot of those. And then if you do get one of those, so like they're for hundreds of thousands or even more. So you'll have like a grant officer who is involved in the project, but only from a distance, and you have to keep them updated so you get paid and can prove that you're delivering what you said you would. That side of the person who's kind of responsible for keeping them up to date is the product owner and sometimes the project manager. The project manager also liaises a lot with senior management to kind of, like I said earlier, if we wanted to get if we had a request to extend the length of the project or anything like that, that's where they come in. Moses, what about you? What about the tech lead side?
Yeah, so technical lead would be involved. So with external stakeholders, most likely if like we're building something that's integrated with a third party, so need to liaise with them and make sure that we are aligned in terms of their expectations and our expectations. And with the senior management, it's more making sure we're reporting in terms of what the effect, like the stuff that we're building right now, does it fit in well with the current technical stack that we have, and are there any issues that we foresee in the future as we implement the work that's needed for the project. Then the team has these 3 principles. So the project manager, the product owner, and the technical lead. And they're they have joint responsibility in terms of making sure the project is delivered. A good way to think about them is they have like an aspect of the project that they are responsible for. So the project manager is responsible for making sure the project is delivered on time and in budget. Product owner is responsible for making sure the what's delivered is useful for the client. In the end, we have to make sure that, yeah, it's usable, it's useful, it makes sense in terms of what was needed from the client. And the technical lead is there to make sure it's feasible, like what we're trying to achieve within that project is technically feasible. Yeah.
The UX lead isn't considered a project principal, mainly because, as I said earlier, there could be multiple projects going on simultaneously, and the UX function kind of sits a little bit outside in a way, because we're what we call cross-cutting, in that we could be working on multiple projects at the same time. So we might sit in multiple teams. So we don't act as principals. The product owner, if you're thinking, if there was a worry maybe that, well, who represents the user, the product owner at Guru is very much involved with the user, with all the user research and everything. So they represent, so we don't need to. And it's good then as well, because we don't have the extra responsibility and we can kind of just do what we want. Which is nice. Typical project timeline. We'll go through this pretty quick because we're actually going to expand on each point separately. A lot of what we'll look at here is things that both UX and tech or engineering will work on together. But obviously some aspects, particularly the stuff Moses will mention, it's not really related to UX. We might, be involved a little bit, to answer questions and so on. But so I won't go into detail on the UX stuff. I will say that everything you learned, unless it's changed a lot in the last 2 years, which I'm pretty sure it hasn't, everything you learned, I still use every day. The approach that I learned at GA, I still use now. The only difference obviously is at GA, all the projects were 2 weeks long. Here, it could be anywhere between 2 weeks and 6 months, who knows? So you just kind of, expand it to fit. And you might do on one project, you might do this on multiple different times, because you might deliver a piece first, hand it over, and then go back and so on. But the approach is the same as what you have just learned. So design studios and research reviews. Like I said, we're going to power through these and then we'll touch on each one separately afterwards. So we've got design studios and research reviews. We've got feasibility. We've got the handover, where we do our annotated designs, user stories, and Jira tickets. Jira is a software that we use. Maybe you're familiar with it, I'm not sure, but it's a software that we use to kind of help with project management and to track everything in time and so on.
Yeah. Then from the designs and user stories, we do the technical design from the tech point of view. Then do estimates, which tell us how long the project will take, and that's used for determining what can be delivered within the allocated time. Then we go into implementation, review and testing, and then user acceptance testing. Yeah.
Well, like I said, we're going to touch on each of these separately. And then finally, we do a retrospective at the end of each project. Our approach is very much our approach. Some of these aspects might sound waterfall or Kanban or agile or whatever. We'll explain kind of how we get to this point, how we got to this being our approach, as we go through it. So to start, we'll go with the research reviews and design studios. So research reviews, it's not really a term as such. I just needed to put something there. It's kind of, I would think about it in two ways. One, it's about having all of the research documented and saved in such a way that any member of the project team, or even outside the project team, could jump in, have a look, and see how it's going and make sense of it all. So it's about documenting it appropriately. And secondly, it's actually having sessions with certain members of the team or whoever's needed to go through it all, to keep people aligned and see how the project's going and why we're going to go in a certain direction. This is a Miro board. We use Miro a little bit when I was at GA, but not that much because we were in person. But actually, one benefit to COVID and the pandemic has been that using Miro has made documenting research a lot better for us, because when I was at General Assembly, we do like all your user interviews, write them all out in post-it notes, put them all over a big window, and then do your affinity maps, and then take pictures of it, and then have to bin everything. And it's kind of annoying because you kind of wanted it in a nice place where you could still move things around if needed. And Miro's made that really good. So on the left, you've got, I don't know, 7 or 8 user interviews, different colors for different users. In the middle, then the first of the affinity map sessions, and then on the next to that, we've taken the affinity map to another level where we kind of delve even deeper within the things that we've uncovered. And then next to that, we created some personas. So this is all stored on Miro. This is only one section of the board. There's way more to the research, like the competitive analysis and loads of ideation and design and everything. It's all on there. But if I took a screenshot of that, you wouldn't be able to see anything. But anyway, the whole point I'm trying to make is that it's really important that everything is in a clear way that anyone can jump in, read it, and understand why the product is going in that direction. It shouldn't be kind of just the UX team that can see that. We would use Miro in sessions where we would get members of the team, ideally the tech lead at a minimum, but also the product owner and anyone who wants to be involved as well, where we take them through this just to kind of say, look, especially say if you have like our CEO who might have an assumption that a certain feature should behave in a certain way, and then we go and do our research and we're like, that didn't come up once. So don't be surprised when we get to the point of design and that feature you want doesn't exist. It's about, you know, being able to justify your decisions. And then for design studios, I'm not sure if you did these remotely for your class, but when we did them, we did them in person. At GA, I mean, at Guru, I've done both in person and remotely during the pandemic. They're, again, for 2 reasons, they're really, really useful. The one that if you've done them at GA, the reason you would have done it more than likely was for the kind of design challenge aspect, where you've got an idea now, but you've maybe come up across a little stumbling block where you're not really certain like what's a good way to approach the design for this. So it's really good for that because you get loads of perspectives in the room to try, you know, help figure that out. You might even get stakeholders, users, whoever involved to get extra perspectives. And then the second reason they're really useful, and this is at Guru, this is the main reason why we do them, is to kind of align the whole project team and SMT and anyone else and stakeholders in the direction of like align them in the thinking of why we're going the direction we're going, but also helping them feel involved as to why we've chosen that way and so on. They're quite fun. It usually is kind of a nice icebreaker, kind of at the start of a project, because it's just a very different hour and a half or 2 hours of your day compared to normal, because you're just playing around, sketching and joking and so on. And yeah, they're usually really good fun. Like the names that are on that board, you've got 2 UX designers, a CTO, a CEO, a CPO, a COO, a senior client services manager, a site delivery manager. Yeah, it's like a mixed bag, and you'll get other ones where you have stakeholders on there as well. And yeah, like I said, they're fun as well. And then feasibility reviews, we do these very, very, I'm just going to bring all this up. So why do we do them? Because if we don't, like, think about a prototype, right? I'm assuming that because you only have 2 weeks on your projects, you probably iterated maybe like 3 times. And let's say you've come up with your idea on prototype 1 and you don't do a feasibility review, and the idea that you've got for your feature and how to implement it tests really well, and you're like, sweet, this is good. I'll user test it again, and I'll user test it again, and then you might get to the end and think, right, it's testing really well, I think we're good to go. If you don't do a feasibility review, you run the risk of getting to the point that when you try to hand that over to a tech team, that they're going to say, yeah, look, it looks great, I like the idea, but that's going to take like a year to implement. There's no way we can do that with our budget, with our time. It's just not feasible. So that's why we do them, to avoid that happening. At GA, we didn't do it at all, and mainly because of time constraints, and also because you don't have a tech team on hand to do it with you. I often thought actually might be cool to merge the software engineering course with the UX course at times for this kind of thing, because it'd be a good way for both to learn, because then the software engineering grads can learn how to not give advice, but like say to learn whether or not something is too big or too small, and so on. Who takes part? At a minimum, the tech lead, so Moses, but ideally all of the project team, really, particularly the tech side. How we do them, pretty informal. On the picture there, that's just, we printed out the research and put it all over the walls of a meeting room, and we all just chatted about it. you like in the remote world, we just share our screens and go through the research or go through a prototype and click through and explain what's going to happen and so on. And how often, I would say, do them with every iteration of your prototype. If you don't change much, so if you do it in your first one and it's fine and they say that's feasible, and then your second prototype or your second iteration doesn't really change that much, well then that's kind of a judgment call. You probably don't need to do it. But if you're changing anything, if you're adding any new interactions or anything like that, you'd want to be doing these each time so that you avoid that risk of going too far and have to go back to the drawing board. It's also quite important around who takes part. Quite important if it's mobile app, well then get the mobile app engineer in there. If it's but if it's web based or on a browser, you need the front end engineer in there too, because a lot of it interaction wise is to do with what is doable on their side. Because the front end engineer in our company at least uses kind of a library, and sometimes certain interactions might work in that library different than how we intend them to work on our prototypes. So yeah, it's probably the most important thing I'll talk about in this session, I think, is doing these feasibility reviews. Then for handover, I keep referring back to when I did it at GA with our client, but all we did then was get the Google Drive, tidy it up, title things appropriately, and just send the link or share the link with the client. We didn't do anything about annotating wireframes. We just did the Google Drive and sent a link to a Zeppelin file, and that was it. But you need way more detail than that. So we do user stories together. They take the format of as a whatever, I want to do a thing so that I can achieve this thing or whatever. They take that format. This is a screenshot from Jira. The reason we both do them is because obviously UX and the product owner have the vision, the site, and the knowledge of what the user wants and so on, and the description and benefits is to give context to the tech team as to why it needs to be done. The tech team take it all, try and make sense of it all, and then the really important thing is the acceptance criteria, which is the minimum we will accept once it's been implemented. We'll touch on that in a lot more detail later on in the other slides. But we do these together. There's a lot of back and forth with these, and actually it doesn't just happen at handover, it happens earlier. Like me and Moses are working on one right now, which I won't hand over until at earliest next Friday, but we're already working on the user stories now. It's quite fun doing them as well, because so you think you know something so well from your prototypes and so on, but when you do the user stories, you're like, oh my god, I didn't even think of that. Like, a lot comes out, especially with the extra perspectives of your product owner and tech team. Then the wireframes. So this is a screenshot from Miro again. All you can see there is one screen, but there's actually about 30-ish screens in a flow. So you need your wireframes, you need your user flows, and you need your screen flows all together. Particularly, you'll want the wireframes and therefore screen flows in order. You want the little red things like highlighted or the different components, and you number them. And then on the left, you say what each component is, and then you go through your annotations, and you need to get into like really detailed on these and say, if I hover over this thing, it needs to change color or whatever. If I click on this thing, this interaction needs to happen, and I need to be taken here. If I type in this text box, there needs to be a character limit of this. Like, all that stuff needs to be in there. And you need to go into a lot of detail as well about to say, like where it says in the top there, name of site, name of client, you'd need to say, if you can see that, you'd need to kind of say where that data is coming from as well. So you need to get in really deep with this. Otherwise, and the more clear you are with it, the less likely whatever gets handed over to you later on when implemented it'll make sense and work as intended. It takes a while, and it's quite boring at times because it's really repetitive and you're just like writing in so much detail about stuff, but it's just the nature of the game, and it only takes up like a small percentage of your overall time, so it only comes up every now and again. I don't really enjoy it, but I do it anyway. Then Sketchcloud and Zeppelin, you're probably familiar with both, or actually I think you guys use Figma. Figma, I think, has its own way of handing over the files so that the components, like your typography, your font size, your colors, all that stuff is kind of mapped out for the front-end engineer to make sense of. But we use Sketch, so you can use Sketchcloud for that, or Zeppelin, which is just a tool to let them get all that information. And then Moses will take you through the rest of it. Oh, well, meetings, I think we both will, Moses.
Yeah.
Daily stand-ups we do, depends really. The early phase of the project, not everyone will be involved in the stand-ups, but from here on, from the handover on, everyone is, and we do them every day. Similar to the stand-ups I assume you guys did. Everyone's talks for like, and no more than a minute for like what we did yesterday, what we're doing today, and if we have any blockers is probably most important. Reason being, I'm sure you know this, is to just keep each other updated on what we're doing so that we might be able to help each other out and so on. And Moses, do you want to tell us about the sprint meetings?
Yeah, so we have weekly sprint meetings. So basically, beyond just what's discussed in the daily stand-up. So during the sprint meetings, we'll pick up items that we want to work on. So they tend to be on Mondays, and we'll have start with reviewing what happened in the previous week, what was delivered, what wasn't delivered, and yeah, just for whatever reason needs more time, and those things happen, but also what's coming up next. So going through, Martin mentioned before Jira. So we've taken all the user stories and put them on Jira. Tech has come in and added tasks to each of them. So we are tracking how we are progressing through each of those user stories. And we'll show you later, like we have what are called swim lanes, or sort of like a Kanban board. And we move the stories across those different boards to indicate the progress that we're making. And so in this meeting, in the sprint meetings, we're just making sure we're at the same level in terms of what has been done and what's coming up next. And also just a sense check in terms of whether we'll be able to deliver the project in time.
Yeah, and we kind of, the sprint bit is we make a commitment to say in this week, either a week or 2 weeks, and in that period, our aim is to deliver this or work on this. And then if it's a 2-week sprint, then the next meeting we'll say, okay, here's how far here's how far we are into delivering what we said we would, and therefore we might need to, we need more work, or we need to like take some out, and we kind of work towards that each time, and then we work in increments like that. So that's why our approach is, it's our own approach. Yeah, and incrementally we work and we just review it in those meetings.
Yeah, so from the stuff that was handed over, so the user stories, the Jira tasks, the technical team takes these and we use them to build the technical design. So here we're looking at what exactly do we need to do in order to build this software that will meet the requirements that have been outlined. So we start with just making sure we have a good understanding of the user stories. And again, the critical thing here is in the description and the acceptance criteria, because acceptance criteria is almost like a checkbox of, can I do this? Yes. Can I do this? Yes. And we also go through that list and make sure that, yeah, we've actually achieved what was requested for. So start with the user requirements, the user stories, and then now we go into the main thing is now designing the architecture. And here we are looking at a couple of different things. One is the database design. So in the user stories, we said like these are the different attributes or data points that we want to track in like in a particular scenario. So we take those and we figure out, okay, how are we going to store them? What's the structure of the tables and the database in order to store all that information in one place and make sure it's accessible based on how based on how we want to retrieve it, either on the front end or the mobile app. Just putting in all those considerations together. And then we go into software components. So here we're thinking mostly about how different pieces of the system will interact with each other. So if we have, so it's closely related to the database design, but we're just making sure that if different parts of the system need to talk to each other, we understand what that looks like and understand what data needs to move in between those. Going to looking into algorithms. So these are just basically complex pieces of logic. As we mentioned before, we have that product called Pinpoint, and like we use it to identify places within a heat network that have inefficiencies or are not working as expected. And yeah, we need to have a time where we stop and think through what are the logical steps that we'll be going through looking at the data that we've received, so as to come to like a conclusion of saying, yes, this apartment, there's some inefficiency in terms of how this apartment has been set up. So that's where you should go and look at what's happening. So those need to be reviewed in advance before we actually start the development. And then there's the API, which is application programming interface. So remember I was talking about how we have a mobile app engineer. So this person will be interacting with the software engineer and they're talking about how this is how the data center has stored the data, but this is how the mobile app wants to retrieve data from the data center. So it's kind of how do these two different parts of the system or pieces of code or logic interact with each other. And yeah, that's basically called API design. And then we go to performance and monitoring metrics. So this is, it can be, there's different approaches that you can take to it. In some scenarios, it's like saying we should have this page load within 5 seconds. So we need a way to say, okay, this particular page loads within 5 seconds. How do we monitor and say that it is actually loading within 5 seconds? What happens if we notice that it's taking longer than 5 seconds to load? So that's like from a user perspective, but we also have the same thing within the data center, like to say, this database should never go above this size, because if it does, then things will start slowing down and users will start complaining. So again, just picking out different parts of our system where we want to make sure we know how they're performing and make sure we monitor how that's going around. Then from all that, we'll start doing estimates. So the estimates are basically a statement of how complex a specific task is, or basically the amount of time that you're going to take to complete a task. And this is, we'll be setting these against each user story that has been defined. So basically we'll say, for example, in this user story, it's going to take 1 week, 2 hours, 2 days and 6 hours. And that sounds very specific, but it's also because this user story has tasks under it, and we put the estimates against each task that you're going to carry out. But the end goal of this is to say, for all the user stories that we've been given, it'll take us, say, 3 months to complete this project. And if it's going to take us 3 months, but for whatever reason, we only have 2 months available, then we need to go back and look at which user stories are actually critical for the client. And now we prioritize those and say, okay, these stories can be delivered within 2 months, and we will still give value to the client if we deliver these. So that's the essential point of the estimates. And what we do is, now once we start running the project, we actually go back and say, this is the actual amount of time we spent doing this. And then we can review at the end of the project and say, okay, we were 80% accurate in our estimates, and just something that we can use going forward in future estimates that we're going to be giving as a tech team.
And I'd say from the, sorry, Moses, I'd say from the product side for the estimates, once the tech team have done that, made their estimates, we as a team, but particularly on the product side, we may have to review the scope, like Moses said, and remove some of the user stories because we don't have enough time. But if they're too important to remove, well, then we have to have a decision about extending the length of the project. Essentially, we're defining the MVP. Like UX will have already done that to a certain extent with user testing, but we might need to refine it even more at this point as a result of the estimates. But it's a judgment call that we make together at that point.
Yeah, then now we go into implementation. So this is just basically the part where coders become coders. Like we put on our black screens and everyone's wondering what we are doing. But yeah, this is essentially the work that goes on around that. So different programming languages, different databases, different tools that we are playing around with just to deliver what's been agreed on the technical design. I'll spend the least amount of time on this slide because it's probably not useful to you guys at this point in time. But yeah, then we go into review and testing. So when a lot of times when you're building something, you're working on it on your machine, and then in the end, it needs to be made accessible to other people. So we have to go through a process of review to make sure that, yes, what I said as a developer is actually working. It's not a case of, yeah, it works on my machine, which would be a thing that you might hear once you like within the industry, because yeah, I tested it when it was on my machine and it works, but yeah, when someone else is testing it, it doesn't work. So we go through that process of peer review and validating the work against the acceptance criteria. So making sure we've actually delivered what the product team was asking for. Yeah.
And then user acceptance testing, usually it's done by the UX lead and the product owner. And again, we're looking at the acceptance criteria here. We're taking on the role of the user at that point, and acting as them. Essentially, the products or the thing that got implemented gets handed to us. We can log in or whatever. We can actually use it as the user would, and we want to make sure that it works as we intended it to. So we check it against, like Moses said earlier, like a tick box almost against the acceptance criteria. Moses also mentioned about the swim lanes on Jira. So the Jira tickets, the user stories, they have statuses. These are the statuses going across there, starting with waiting product definition. So when we do our designs and do our annotations, that's the status. When we're finished and we hand it over, it becomes waiting dev estimate. When devs do their estimate, it goes into ready for development. When they start the coding, it's in development. And then when they finish their reviews, it goes into ready for testing. And at this point, we take over, we do our user acceptance testing. If it looks good and the acceptance criteria is met, then it passes and it moves to complete and tested and happy days. But if it fails, we have to update the ticket. We'll assign it to Moses, who's the tech lead, and explain on the ticket why it failed and what should have happened and so on. Then change the status back to waiting dev estimate, at which point Moses will have decided he's going to do it or someone else is going to do it. If it's quick work, they probably won't estimate it, but if it's a longer fix, they will estimate it, and then goes back into development, and then eventually comes back to ready for testing to us again. If it fails again, it goes back through that cycle, but obviously if it passes, it moves to complete and tested. And we've said a few times now how important acceptance criteria is. This is why, because if you don't do the acceptance criteria, tech will implement something based on God knows. We'll receive it. We'll have an understanding in our head of what it should do, but how are they supposed to know what that understanding is? So that's why we need acceptance criteria. Can you guys hear Moses?
Don't think so.
Sorry, can you hear now?
Yeah. Yeah, I thought that was me.
Sorry. I have a baby in the house, so they randomly start crying and I have to mute myself. Anyway, yeah, so we go into the retrospective at the end of the project. So this is basically looking back at how we ran the project and thinking through what things went well, what we could have done better, and just looking at actions that we can take from it. So this is like just from the first time that we did the verify retrospective, and some of the aspects that came up in terms of what went well, and things that we thought okay, this could have been better if like a certain situation is different. I know one of the times in one of the projects we ran, we had a contractor working as a front-end developer, and one of the things that came out of that was, wouldn't it be great if we had the front-end developer working for us full-time? And yeah, like
And now
that feedback was passed to the senior management team, and we hired a front-end developer, and that's made the project cycle a lot better. So this is really just thinking of how we can make things better over time, and even the timeline that we have in terms of how the project is run. A lot of that has been influenced by the feedback that we get from the retrospectives.
Yeah, I think in true UX fashion, we just iterate. Every time we do a project, we do one of these, and whatever comes out of it, if it's agreed upon, we as in within the project team, we implement it, and then we make a slight change to the how we approach future projects, and like how we do it now compared to how we did it 2 years ago is very different, in a good way. And otherwise, you're just going to plod along making the same mistakes over and over again. Then comes launch. And to be honest, I can't really put it any better than that. Even though we've done all of that work, there's still a lot of work to do. But, well, here's what it is. You've got marketing. If you need to hand over that product to someone to support it, and in our case, it's internal, so it's our support team, customer support team, or our operations team. You need to write training documentation for the new customers and do onboarding, because especially with a new product, or if it's an existing product but something new has been released, you have to write all the release notes and so on, so that it makes sense. Like on Sketch, for example, or on any product you use, when you update it, there'll be a release note there that most people don't read, but you still need to do it. And then if you've got a mobile app, you need to launch it on one of the stores. That all takes work, but lucky for us, we don't really need to worry about that. The product owner does all of that, and we kind of just leave them to it. Obviously, we help where needed, but this is what I was saying about the product owner being involved with the product the whole way through its life cycle, whereas in our case, we're more like during the project. And just some final tips from me: involve engineering or tech as early as possible, like on day one if you can. Get them involved in the research if they have time. It helps to keep them informed of why you're doing what you're doing, or why the product is that way. We do a lot of field research because obviously we go to homes and dwellings and developments and so on. And if we can bring the engineers, bring them, because it gives them a lot more context as to why why the product is why it is. I think both of those we'd only just started to bring the engineers on field research when COVID kicked in. But if we had actually done that on day one and verify, I think it would have made a big difference. So we've changed that. The pandemic blocked us. And Moses?
Yeah, I think the feasibility reviews, I think those are really key. And here it's especially the part about involving the engineering team as you're doing the feasibility. I know one of the things that is encouraged for UX designers is to go crazy in terms of the different ideas that you come up with. But then at some point you need to go back to the engineering team and ask, so for all these different things that we want to do, which of them are feasible or not? And the other thing to bear in mind with that is feasible is relative. So in a company like Guru, where we have about 10 engineers, what's feasible for us is different for, like, if you're working at Google and there's 1,000 engineers, there's a lot more you can do there versus what you can do at Guru. So maximize the potential that you have. So that's just the thing to bear in mind as you're going through the feasibility reviews. Clear user stories are very critical. So just make them as specific as possible. As we mentioned, the acceptance criteria is the thing that makes sure you've sort of communicated as clearly as possible what you expect from the engineering team when they deliver the task or the story. Otherwise, if it's ambiguous, you will get an ambiguous result as well. and yeah, you'll go back through that whole process again. And then a really critical one is scope creep. So scope creep is where you do your initial design. Maybe there's like you have like 5 different actions that someone can do on a screen. And then a few weeks later, you're like, actually, could we add these 2 more actions? And you're like, okay, why is that the case? And then 2 weeks later, you're like, okay, just these final 2. So now you moved from having 5 actions on a screen to 9 actions. That gets very hard to work with at an engineering point of view, because if you're working with a fixed scope, then it becomes difficult to have an end in time. And as well, depending on what is being changed, we might have to go back all the way to our technical design to figure out, is this request actually doable or not? So yeah, try as much as possible, as I said before, to make the stories as specific as possible, and then stick with them.
Yeah,
as much as you can.
From a product side or UX side on that, the 2 points at which you need to be careful there is, whatever you hand over at handover, don't change it after that. Leave it at that. Get to your point then. Don't start trying to keep doing tests and so on afterwards. And then when you get stuff handed over to back to you implemented, because things sometimes look different or behave different once it's been implemented than they did on a prototype or how you imagined it. Don't start getting excited thinking, oh, wouldn't it be really nice to add in this little thing as well? If there are little tiny things, have a chat with the front end engineer or whoever. And if it's a 20-minute thing, they'll just do it anyway. You don't have to create tickets. But if it's big, forget about it. Don't start handing tickets back saying as like a fail of UAT because you want an extra thing. They're the 2 areas really. I think that's us.